As earlier, I'm going to introduce our moderator first. He is a recipient of the prestigious G.U. Pope Award by the government of Tamil Nadu for his creative contributions. He is the chair of the Center for Study in Public Sphere at the Roja Muttaya Research Library. He is a steering committee member of the Global Forum for Media Development. He is an advisory panel member of the Knight International Journalism Fellowship program administered by the ICFJ. He is a member of the governing body of the K.M. Adimoolam Foundation for Arts in Chennai. He is an editorial advisor for the long-form magazine, The Little Magazine. He is also the executive director of the media development organization present in 5 countries, PANOS, South Asia. He is a columnist, a teacher of journalism, and adjunct faculty of the Asian College of Journalism here in Chennai. He also held the post of the chair of the JCB Literature Prize jury for 2022. He was a Reuters Fellow at the University of Oxford. He was also the reader's editor of The Hindu for nearly a decade. He was an independent internal news ombudsman, functioning with clearly formulated terms of reference. He has directed a film named Making Trouble Where There Is None. This was produced by The Hindu's Frontline magazine, and it's a documentary about communal mobilization under the cover of Ganesh Chaturthi, Vinayaka Chaturthi, if you will, in Chennai. He has lectured widely in the UK, the United States of America, and Europe, and he is here today to moderate our session too. Let me welcome Professor A.S. Paneerselvan. Thank you, sir. It's a pleasure to have you here with us. Before I share the topic of session 2, I'm sure you already have it on your mobiles and in the advertisement that you would have seen or the social media push. But I must share this quote before I share the name of the session once again here. Leo Tolstoy, in his book, Tak što je nam delats, which translates to, Then What Must We Do?, has written, I sit on a man's back, choking him and making him carry me, and yet assure myself and others that I am sorry for him and wish to lighten his load by all means possible, except by getting off his back. With this quote, I announce the name of our next session. It is The Language and Commerce of the Empire. My question here was whether I should capitalize the "the," but I decided to leave it in lowercase. I would like to introduce the writers for this session and then welcome them to join our moderator. In alphabetical order by surname. Thomas Manuel's work predominantly revolves around history, science, education, or the intersection of all three. And isn't that fascinating? He is a freelance writer, and his journalism can be found in Lapham's Quarterly, The Nib, The Wire, The Hindu, and various other outlets. An award-winning playwright, his accolades include the 2016 Hindu Playwright Award for his play Hamlet and Angad. It is now available in a collection from Dhawli Books. Thomas Manuel currently works on India Inc., a public history project where he makes videos on how the past continues to affect us today. Today on discussion is his work, Opium Inc., How a Global Trade Funded the British Empire. Our other author, well, she's a very, very, very interesting person, just as each one of our authors and moderators here are. Now, Bhojpuri was taken to Trinidad in the 19th century by a migrant worker from India. And how thankful we are to him for that. Do you know why? Because Dr. Peggy Mohan was born in 20th century Trinidad, where she studied linguistics, specializing in Creole languages. And when she submitted her doctoral dissertation in linguistics at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, it was on Trinidad Bhojpuri. She followed this with a study of Trinidad Bhojpuri as a classic language death situation. She has since lived in Delhi, taught linguistics at JNU, mass communications at Jamia Millia Islamia, produced a television series in Hindi for preschool children, taught music at Basant Valley School, written many journal articles on Indian languages and the factors responsible for language change. She now teaches linguistics at the Ashoka University and has authored 4 books. Of them, today on discussion is Wanderers, Kings, Merchants, the story of India through its languages. Let's put our hands together for Thomas Manuel and Peggy.
Good afternoon. These 2 books, at some level, capture the idea of the emergence of modernity. It traverses about 4 centuries. The emergence of the modern nation state, colonial engagement, different types of migrations, and the power. For me, the interesting aspect of these books are some of the defining metaphors which come through this book. But let me start with Peggy Morgan's book. I would like to start with this idea of using this tiramisu bear. How did you come up with this idea of tiramisu bear as a metaphor to understand the plurality of the languages of this region?
This happens to be a day when I'm probably wearing a sari chosen for me by the person who I happen to be wearing a sari chosen by the person who came up with the metaphor of the tiramisu bear because of her love of cold coffee. I was absolutely fascinated by a creature that's begun to appear in the Arctic, which is a hybrid variety of a polar bear and a grizzly bear. Now, the polar bear does not migrate. Female polar bear and a male grizzly bear. Grizzly bears migrate, the males do. The females of any species don't migrate. Now that's a strong metaphor because it's going to be in everything that I write about language in India and elsewhere. Females with great difficulty migrate, if at all. Males do. So the male goes north in the wrong time of year because climate change has woken him up too early. He finds a female polar bear and mates with her, and there is an offspring which has the characteristics of both in a predictable way. Whenever you see this bear, you know immediately the parentage is female polar bear and male grizzly. And it's a metaphor of me too. My father was a normal Indian student who went to Canada at the time when you fall in love, and very few women were migrating. His sisters did later, but very few women from our community were going, even though there was no reason why we shouldn't. So he met my mother, who was from, again, an island off Canada and Newfoundland. And he met her and didn't think twice about it, that they fell in love, they got married, he took her to a place where she never ever saw snow again. So the metaphor of the streams of 2 parents in a very predictable way, the male migrating and the female being found where the migration has happened, and them having children. The children grow up with quite a lot of the knowledge that the mother had, the confidence maybe that the mother had, the ability to blend locally, if that's where they stay. And later on, around school age, begins to address what the father's legacy is. And that is a metaphor that carries through in India, that in all these hybridization situations, there are men coming, having children, because men cannot have children by themselves. They have to marry a local woman. And so they would have children, and slowly these children would bring into their father's language the language they knew first, which is their mother's language. so that there's a hybridizing process. And we've been spending far too long looking at the very visible paternal side of language, which is the words. The language, the side that gives the words. Sanskrit gave these words, this is all Indo-European. Yes, but there's quite a lot in modern India, has nothing to do with Sanskrit, it's older. And it's all come through the female line, and nobody pays attention to it if all you're looking at is words. And I am, as a Creolist, trying to change that, because in the old days, all we had were philologists who said, oh, you know, this word has come into Sanskrit from Munda, but yeah, words come in everywhere. Who hasn't used the word origami? We're not Japanese. But when you do very strange things in the north of India with the way you make your past tenses, or you in all over India make a distinction between the and the, which tells an immense amount about the earliest migration of all, because it links you to Africa and all the way to Australia. You're beginning to see that language, like many living things, has two parents. Sorry, I went a little long on that, but I like my tiramisu bear.
No, but before going to Thomas, I have one more question. This idea of using wanderers along with kings, that is a very interesting pairing. How did these wanderers and kings were paired together in your search of understanding the history of languages?
Okay, full disclosure, that was not my title. Because if I had to give a title, I would have brought in women somewhere, because women are a very big part of that hidden layer in language. But every publisher knows that you can't put women in the title of a book or a TV series or a film, or the only people who will look at it are women. They didn't want that. So that we went back and forth all sorts of ways, and they said, and we don't want us to limit it to linguists. We want people who are looking at Indian history to get a sense of this. I said, yes, it is history. It's not about kings. The two kinds of people that I really am interested in don't figure in the title, which is women and the little people, the people's history type thing. They knew that they needed to keep something there that would get a larger audience. I hate to say it, but we all learn it very quickly. Don't talk about women, children, and poor people, or your book will not sell.
Thank you for that note. I've been an editor, and we give headlines, and sometimes we keep this in mind, whether a headline is becoming a hook or it is not working as a hook.
Yeah.
The test is your headline a hook? That is the first test which news editors like to conduct. Now, coming back to your book, of all the elements of colonialism, why did you choose opium?
Yeah, thank you so much. So my book, Opium Inc., is about how in the 19th century, there was a thriving opium trade between India and China, colonial India and China, and how that trade was kind of the economic foundation of the British Empire and the East India Company specifically at that time. And the reason I wrote about it was simply because before I found out that this thriving century-long trade existed, it was nowhere, nowhere in my history textbook was this mentioned, nowhere in a general history of India does this get its due. And once I discovered this fact and started reading into it, the more I found that it was really central to how India was colonized, like in the first place. I think the history of Bombay cannot be told without the history of the opium trade. And the fact that you can walk through South Bombay and not see that truth kind of like made very clear to you was to me like a shocking and surprising thing. And I thought this was something that people would be excited to read about. And I think it is quite a fascinating subject.
See, this opium was touched in the fiction of Amitav Ghosh. What is the difference in the approach you had from Amitav Ghosh's documentation of opium?
So Amitav Ghosh's Ibis trilogy is a phenomenal kind of magisterial work, and clearly we are inspired by the exact same things. And the only kind of contribution I think that I make over and above that book is that I make very clear what part is fiction and what part is non-fiction. That's about it, you know. I think like my strength is like I'm not a historian by training or anything like that. My strength is that like as a journalist, I'm a communicator. Like I try to take something that I think is quite a complex subject with a lot of facets that are quite hard to kind of break down in an accessible and simple manner, and I kind of tried to do that. So this book is a kind of non-fiction. You could see it as a non-fiction companion to Amitav Ghosh's like series. Yeah.
See, I would like to make this session an interactive one. Therefore, after posing one more question to each one of them, I would like all of you to join. Therefore, this question is the idea of having Creole as an interesting metaphor of intermingling and mixing. How did that happen?
Well, it happened because I grew up first learning Creole linguistics from the time I was about 17 years old. I'm a native speaker of Creole, if anything. My Indian languages came later, and I had to force my family to let me learn anything Indian because they thought it would just be pulling us back to the days of estate labor. Creole was something that was happening almost in living time, in historical time. We knew that there was the slave trade. We knew how recently people had been trafficked. We knew where they had come from. We didn't know everything. We had a lot of misconceptions too. But the idea that languages could come out of two streams, where there was an African stream, which was like the maternal stream, because the African stream gave the grammar and the structure to these languages, and the words were given like sperm donation by fleeting parents, the lexifiers, European settlers. Now, initially that sounded like a wonderful metaphor because you see it in Europe. All the languages of the Mediterranean area of Europe, you begin to see mixture in a way, things that don't look like Latin. Where did they come from? Why are they different? Why is French different from Spanish? Obviously something to do with the Gauls. Why is Spanish different from Italian? Why is Romanian full of case? No, it's not because they are more Latin, it's because they're closer to the Slavic region. So there's a substratum, which if you don't dig for it, you will not see it, but you'll see all these lovely words that seem to mix, to mesh. Then I came to India. I was already primed for it. I come from an Indian family in Trinidad. I've been hearing Indian languages all my life. And I said, this is the same thing as I saw in Europe. And this is the same thing as I saw in the Caribbean, the Creoles, that there's a substratum of something that makes Bangla very different from Marathi and very different from Hindi, while there's something that makes it similar. And there are two things pulling in opposite directions, and it looks like the Creole thing. People have been wondering. Then some students at Bombay University said, go ahead and say it. I said, I'll get into trouble. They said, no, say it has to be said. Then I wrote it, nothing happened. Everybody said, hey, that's interesting. Then I'm writing now, taking it further, because I think that the Caribbean situation was analyzed wrong. And it was much more similar to the Indian situation. Now, in this book, I'm taking the Indian situation and seeing a very different timeline in how the hybridization happened. There was no primordial chaos of people not knowing what to do, coming up with a pidgin, and then it coalesces into a Creole, and then we Sanskritize our way up. I'm beginning to see that the first people who meet foreigners who come are not in any way uneducated. They tend to have instincts that allow them to learn languages quite well. Quite well means with a local accent, and that is what was meant in the very snooty Sanskrit days by a Prakrit. Prakrits are essentially almost Sanskrit with a very strong local accent, Dravidian, Sandhis, etc. So you get it's the opposite way around. So I'm taking Indian data, Indian experience, applying it to the same situation and saying, no, if you looked at history properly, you'd find that even in Africa, the first people to meet, the first slaves to be trafficked were on a small scale. They learned Prakrits of English, like Indian English. And then much later came the huge mixing. And I'm seeing it similar. You hear of Prakrits, but you don't hear of modern Indian languages till the 12th century. So now I'm looking at something that's happening in real time, Dakkini, and to see if actually there is this kind of pattern of initially people who learn the language quite well and then a huge horde coming in. So I'm trying to not first take the Creole model to understand India and then say, no, but the Creole model is deficient. Can we use India to reform it? And there's someone in Africa who's doing the same thing, so I'm not alone.
See, one aspect of the opium trade is that it persists even today. And if you look at the developments in Afghanistan, it would not have been possible without the opium funding. Therefore, opium has reinvented itself for different regimes, from the colonial regime to the post-colonial regime to the independent liberalized regime. Opium seems to be one commodity which manages to reinvent itself. How do you look at the durability of this material?
Yeah, so I think there is this kind of stigma that comes with the word that is one of the things I try to kind of tackle. If you think of opium in sort of prehistory, it is the poppy plant, which comes from is just another kind of herb, another part of folk medicine. It's something that common people take to ease their aches and pains, to go to sleep. In the Mughal times, it was something that was a kind of like recreational intoxicant for sure, but at the same time, it had a lot of practical purposes, right? Like this was an empire that stretched across such a large swath of land that couriers, like people who carried messages from like one city to another city, would go by foot. And if you have to, travel hundreds of kilometers by foot to carry a message, something like opium is, makes that possible, just dulls the pain in your lower back and knees and things like that. So there is this long history of opium as a medical product, completely not stigmatized, not a commodity. And then with colonization, with colonialism, there is this, it becomes a trade good. It becomes something that can be kind of mass produced, mass exported, and sold. Starts with the Dutch and then moves to the Portuguese, and then the English institute a national system. They take it from being something that is unorganized to something that is a state monopoly, that at its peak, 1 million peasant households over 500,000 acres of land are producing this product so that it can be exported to China primarily. At its peak, this is a volume of trade that would be equivalent to like $1 billion today, 15 million pounds in 1879 or something like that. And there is something like that happens at that time, which is that this is an addictive product, and that's why the English are so attracted to it, right? That China at this point, the English are seeing it as a market, seeing it as a place for profit, but the Chinese empire has no interest in any trade goods from Britain. And so Britain comes up with this idea of selling them opium, kind of creating a market for themselves, creating a captured populace and things like that. And I think it's just that kind of sort of cruel logic that keeps it in play even today. Like you mentioned Afghanistan and things like that. The Golden Triangle in Southeast Asia. All of that is this sense of like, this product is illegal. It was illegal even the Chinese Empire at that point of time, but it is addictive, and because of that, it can be turned into some kind of revenue source for, people without the best intentions. Yeah.
Can we understand opium as the earliest crypto?
Mr. Panneerselvam asking the profound questions. At the risk of being too opinionated, yeah, in the sense that they're both a bit of a scam. Like it just.
Okay. See, one aspect of looking at the languages is its own trajectory. For instance, if you take my language, Tamil, around 17th, 18th century, the emergence of Tamil prose democratized Tamil. And this emergence of prose happened due to multiple reasons, including Tamil's engagement with colonialism. Therefore, emergence of somebody like Vallala, Taimanar and Vallalar, the earlier poets, actually helped Tamil to move away from rigid poetic constraint to a much more democratized prose. How do you look at the emergence of prose in these languages?
Now you're talking about something quite late, in the 17th century, you're saying? Yes, in fact, that was around the time also that people had started moving away from, in the Deccan, from writing in Persian. They were writing suddenly in poetry still, but literary. So their languages have a tendency to respond not to words, nouns, and rules. They respond to political, economic situations. They're a wonderful mirror of history and things that are happening. So you find that certain ages in India which stand out as times when people start wishing to address the common people when their audience was something else earlier. You're talking about one. In the Deccan, around the time of Aurangzeb, they were also starting to protest and address the common people. A lot of writing, as opposed to the early memorization of the Rig Veda and the different Vedas, writing came up with a very different intent. And it was prose initially, which was all the secular things that we do in our daily lives. We make lists. We write a legal writ against somebody. We basically, it's very much housekeeping type work. It's not literary at all. So there is a tendency for language to get written and to be useful. And when it is not very literary. So the things like poetry have sound very deeply embedded in it, beauty. They tend less to be addresses to the common people, whereas you'll notice that there are many times in India, this is one in the case of Tamil, in the 12th century in Kerala, it happened with Mani Pravalam coming up. It was just simply a way of saying, look, something has happened. We are looking a little more inward. We're looking at people here we were not looking at before, and they will probably read our stuff if it's in their language. And of course, you pull in a lot of Sanskrit words in the Deccan. And in somewhere around the 10th to 12th centuries, all over the north of India, little things start coming up. And it's very good for us because prose is that wonderful thing that tells you a little more about how people were speaking. Like, if you want to know about how people spoke Urdu, you don't go to Ghalib's poetry. You go to the letters he wrote to his friends, and they're quite accessible. I mean, I went and I delved through them to get a sense of how people spoke. And that has its own kind of history, because you see, that's not just expounding for beauty. It is communicating to people. And when you're communicating to people, it's very useful for people like me. and it also is a very strong indicator that other things are happening in the country. I would choose those moments to look at, and those are the moments of change also.
See, if you're looking at the opium, the area where it was cultivated, the Indo-Gangetic Plain, it also had another interesting commercial crop, indigo. How is opium so completely different from indigo? Because indigo has been embedded within the nationalist movement, including the Champaran agitation. Everybody understands indigo in a range of different ways. But why is opium not given the same importance as indigo in understanding our past?
Yeah, it's a really kind of fascinating question about like why this trade, which was so large, opium was at one point in time the third highest source of revenue for the colonial government behind land and salt. You know, land tax we've heard a lot about. The salt taxes are firmly fixed in our imagination as an oppressive like thing, but we don't hear about opium. And you brought up indigo. Indigo is again something that, you know, the images of exploitation of those indigo workers was something that, you know, came up in the nationalist movement, was used to evoke, you know, nationalism. And the reason that opium is not a part of that conversation at all, to put it simply, is because people were embarrassed by it. It was a complicated subject because even as the nationalist movement was picking up pace, there was this question of, it's a revenue source for the country. Once India gained independence, the question of would we stop exporting opium to China was not solved. In fact, most of the nationalist leaders were sort of afraid to criticize it because, for one part, they were scared of alienating any sympathizers they had in Britain and abroad who were potentially invested in that trade for whatever reason. And secondly, because, like, unlike alcohol, which you know, the nationalist movement, you know, was kind of loud in its criticism about, it did not affect the native populace. It was the problem. It was the problem of a foreign nation and a foreign people, and it was kind of easy to ignore for that reason. But, you know, in the Congress in 1924, which is very late, 1924 is so, like, it's after the trade has collapsed. It's after there's been international agreements against opium. In 1924, the Congress make their first statement against the opium trade. And I think it comes as a relief for a lot of people, actually, because there is Gopal Krishna Gokhale who says, you know, that he was, like, he says he's relieved because there was this moral pain he felt where he was like, you know, I couldn't criticize the trade because we were profiting off it, and I'm so glad that it's finally kind of, you know, we've taken this stance. Because, you know, even there's this great quote from an editorial in the Hindu in 1889 where the quote is, "Opium is a great evil, but national bankruptcy is a greater evil." So there is this kind of economic logic in place. Yeah.
See, now you're looking at the South Indian languages, Malayalam and Konkani. Could you tell us what are though the book is going to come a bit later, what are the fascinating aspects you notice in these two languages?
In which two?
In Malayalam first. So let's start with
Malayalam is the only language in India which took its Indo-European words directly from Tatsama Sanskrit. In the north, all the words that look as though they came from Sanskrit did not. They came from a local Prakrit, which is why you get the differences from place to place. And that crisp sound of pure Sanskrit, because it came into Malayalam via the literature, via people who actually were previously writing in Sanskrit. What happened in the north of India instead was a very long gestation period where little people were speaking. I would love to think they were speaking the Indus Valley languages, and it's a big trek to find out. They were silent. You didn't hear of them anywhere. And the Prakrits were there among the royalty and Sanskrit among the Brahmins. And slowly, as times changed and city dwelling, town dwelling came up, trades came up, you started finding the common people adopting words out of the Prakrits, but with grammars that had nothing at all to do with Sanskrit. They were older. So, but again, the pure Sanskrit words in Hindi came only at the time of the British. They decided that, look, we have to get rid of all this Persian. They did to some extent. They did it very forcibly without understanding Hindi is not Malayalam. You couldn't do it. It just was, it felt wrong. So there was something interesting because I actually did not look at Malayalam because I wanted to deal with a language I knew so little of. It's just that it seemed like a complete remake of the story of Vedic people coming into India, a small number of men meeting a huge society which was going on, where there were other languages undoubtedly, marrying the woman or staying to themselves and having a document. And I thought, if all we knew of modern Kerala was that it had Nambudris and that they had the Rig Veda, how little we would know and how similar they are. So is it possible that the Indus Valley area was quite a bit more diverse? There was quite a lot more going on that we don't have a sense of. So I like to reach out to Kerala as a metaphor of a lot of things that have happened in India. And the idea that there's a huge landmass around the Nambudri Eelams, which speaks Malayalam, and where the Nambudris themselves actually very quickly threw away whatever modern Indian language they must have come with. They kept their Sanskrit and they spoke Malayalam to this day, almost immediately. So you're getting a pattern. So in a way, I'm always going to be looking to see if I see a model there. So Kerala in its own right is interesting, but it's even more interesting if it gives us a larger picture of something that's happened again and again in India.
See, this interesting aspect of having, this interesting aspect of having a language for domestic purposes and a language for public purposes, so to speak, or to borrow the old Tamil classification of Agam and Puram. In this is very, very clear. Malayalam was the Agam language and Sanskrit was the Puram language. How do you look at this coming to terms with negotiating two languages simultaneously?
We do it all the time in India. We've done it from as far back as we have any memory, which probably goes back before Sanskrit. Sanskrit was not a language. It was actually spoken by the general people. It was known by a few scholars who contributed to composing the Rig Veda. And they were men. So there was, again, a male-female divide among this. This is something that, Persian. Government was in Persian, but early Urdu, which was called Hindi, was coming up in Delhi. We had this, it's called diglossia, the technical term. It's not bilingualism, it's diglossia, which basically means that there's some things you do in the home language or in a little language, and there are other things that you have to move to a higher language. We're doing it right now by having this in English. We can use an excuse that I don't know Tamil, but that may not be the real reason. There's a fact that English is kind of earmarked for this kind of discourse. And we have, and right now we're all male and female, but even in the north of India, if you may have noticed that Manmohan Singh, whenever reading from the teleprompter, he would read beautifully when there was lines in Urdu. And when there were lines written in Devanagari script, he would struggle. So even to this day, there's a male-female divide. To know Devanagari and Gurmukhi, you are a woman. Whereas if you were a man of his age, you were educated in Persian and Urdu. And there's a huge cultural rift between men and women and the kind of work that is done in the men's language and in the women's language. Men, of course, also know the women's language. Women understand the men's language, but often are not allowed to speak it. My Sanskrit professor loves to tell a story, which perhaps is his own, he hasn't said that, of a student of recitation who was reciting probably the Rig Veda, that was what they recited, and he got one accent on a word wrong. And he kept getting it wrong, and it was driving the Pandit's wife crazy. And she finally said to him, just keep giving me variations, you are not getting it right. She was not allowed to say, she knew it. She knew what he should do. And even my friends nowadays from such families who decide to teach Sanskrit to earn a living, they have to break a block in their head that a woman does not do this. So there's an interesting division. I remember once talking to an old woman from Kerala. I was told, meet her, she'll tell you about Malayalam. And she was telling me about Sanskrit. And she was reciting from the Rig Veda, and my mind exploded. She could have been Shakuntala. This is what you call a Prakrit. But she didn't say she was speaking Prakrit. She, as a woman, could not pronounce it the way her brothers would have been trained to pronounce it. You were seeing a gender divide right there in something where the woman is actually a scholar. So we have been living with division for so long. It's not a very good thing, but it's just amazing that we managed to do it so very well.
Thank you. I would like to take questions we are in the final session.
Good morning, ma'am. You have traveled many places and you have seen a lot of people, very different cultural. What I am trying to ask is, what's the specific cultural habit and anything specific about Indian people you have seen from another peoples?
Well, if I can give you a simple answer, yes. Indians are specific in having retroflexion. And just like Australian Aborigines, the only peoples I know in the world who have it, yes. And it's very interesting when something is unique because it gives you a picture of history of a migration. But if Indians were totally unique, it would not be so interesting, because it's wonderful if looking at India helps you understand the rest of the world, that you see it first in India and then you say, is it possible that in other places people have been doing similar things? And you start saying, yes, actually, if you look at the details. So I prefer to think that Indians are not unique, but just the first thing that we see that helps us understand a lot of other people.
My question is with you. I would just wanted to know that why opium is not that much addictive to those who are in India. As such, it was happened in China or any other places in the world.
So opium as a product, as a material good, is probably as addictive anywhere in the world. But in India specifically, it was never widely available. Whatever was produced in India was produced as a monopoly by the British for export. So it was never widely available in stores or to common people. The people who were exposed to it were farmers who were, partially coerced to grow it, and many of them did, get addicted to it by accident. Yeah. But thank you for your question.
We have a question. One more question, one final question.
Yes, please.
This is a corollary to what was just asked. I am just curious to know whether our refusal to accept the opium problem has something to do with the fact that some of the oldest Indian entrepreneurs and business houses were funded on opium money.
Yeah, that's again a complicated question, but yeah, it's one of the things I talk about in the book, is that to some extent that history of opium as a business that led to Bombay's great wealth and all of those Bombay, trading houses and families that we all kind of know by name, that is a history that is sometimes nice and convenient to forget. I don't think, the question of how intentional it was is a complex question, but I think as a nation, we have wanted to forget it as well. Like, yeah.
Thank you, because it's an interesting session where we looked at our history, one through opium trade and another one through languages. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much for being a superb moderator with such insightful questions and authors that have written books that are quite disruptive, I must say, in nature and in explanation. There are so many questions I have. I know most of you would be dying to pick up their books because now I want to read and see and argue with them. From us, a token of our love, an appreciation for your presence and for your time. Thank you so much. But in conclusion, I must say, that's why they call it mother tongue for a reason, don't they, Peggy? I'm sure she'll agree with me. And Poppy, as such, as Khaskhas, we've known it so intimately in our everyday. It's a harmless little thing that sits in the Anjara Peti, as we call it in Tamil. Anjara Peti is not 5.5 compartments. It's 5-roomed compartment where we put all our little things, which also includes khaskhas, which we use in our food. And to see it vilified is difficult for us because we only see it as opium, which is so far removed from what we see as poppy. All said and done, thank you so much for a scintillating, thought-provoking, interesting session.